Thank you, Yvonne. Good morning. I'm going to follow up on from Majella's presentation this morning, and I'm going to go through the implications under, as Yvonne said, sourcing chemicals directly from the UK, both from Great Britain and from Northern Ireland from the 1st of January 2021. And I'll cover some of the provisions under REACH that Majella didn't cover this morning. So, for example, safety data sheets and restrictions. And then I'm going to move on and cover three other pieces of legislation. And I know some of you are interested in the CLP regulation and how that will work, bringing chemicals in. Also, the export-import regulation and the detergents regulation. So there's the overview, as I said, the classification and labelling and packaging regulation, that there's implications there in that there are duties for importers to ensure that products brought in are classified, labelled, packaged correctly, but also there are duties there to notify both to EU agencies and to national agencies regarding hazardous chemicals coming into the country. Under REACH, as I said, we have safety data sheets, and also there are restrictions that need to be complied with. And then we have specific information requirements, including labelling and packaging requirements for detergent products. And there are also specific regulations for very hazardous chemicals being exported from the EU to non-EU countries, and also the import of very hazardous chemicals coming into the EU, and I'll cover them. And finally, I'll go through some scenarios that will hopefully help you to understand what your roles will be if you bring chemicals in from the UK. Firstly, and Majella has touched on this already, just to mention about the Northern Ireland Protocol and how it's going to work in practice if you were bringing chemicals in from Northern Ireland or indeed supplying them to Northern Irish companies. And what we understand from the Northern Ireland Protocol and also the readiness notices that have been prepared by the Commission is that in regards to the CLP regulation, under the protocol, CLP will apply in respect of Northern Ireland, meaning that any chemicals traded between ourselves here in Ireland and Northern Ireland have to comply with all the rules set out in that CLP regulation. Similarly, with the detergents regulation, any detergents traded across from Northern Ireland to Ireland must comply. So anything that we supply to Northern Irish companies must comply with the detergents regulation, and anything that they supply to us must comply with the detergents regulation. It's a little bit different when you come to talk about the export-import regulation, in that it applies to Northern Ireland, meaning that the movement of chemicals between Northern Ireland and Ireland will not be considered as exports and imports under the regulation. So essentially what's going to happen is that we will trade with Northern Ireland and they will trade with us with regards to chemicals, as we always have done with our EU countries, other EU countries. To start off with the classification, labelling and packaging requirements under the CLP regulation. If you are going to bring chemical substances or mixtures indirectly from Great Britain, that is England, Scotland and Wales, from the 1st of January next year, then, as Majella mentioned this morning, you were formerly a distributor or a downstream user under the regulation. You will now become an importer. And becoming an importer brings a lot of added responsibilities. And under the CLP regulation, the most important of these are classifying chemicals correctly according to the criteria and rules set out in the CLP regulation. And once you have determined the classification, to assign the correct EU hazard labelling. There are also, of course, obligations there with ensuring that you have safe packaging, and there are a number of specific packaging requirements set out under CLP, such as child-resistant fastening for consumer products. Now, there's a little bit of good news on this slide, and you'll see there that I have two asterisks. If you note that the UK are going to implement a CLP adopting the UN GHS system. And CLP is the EU adoption of the GHS system. So therefore, we'll be very closely aligned. However, that's not to say that they will be exactly the same, because some of the, for example, hazard statements in the CLP regulation are not in the GHS system. So it doesn't resolve you from checking the classification of your products and ensuring that the labelling is correct. You will still need to determine that that's correct. However, as I said, it will be a little bit easier in that the two should be quite closely aligned. And here I've just depicted a sample hazard label for a substance, or it could indeed be for a mixture, and you'll see there that all the label elements that are required under Article 17 of CLP are applied in the pictograms and the hazard statements, etc., are all listed there. One thing I did highlight here in the red circle is supplied by, and it's very important that the EU supplier details are listed on a hazard label. That means that if you bring any chemical substances or mixtures in from Great Britain from the 1st of January next year, the UK details can no longer remain on the hazard label. They must be an EU supplier detail. So if you're responsible here in Ireland for bringing it in, your EU supplier details must be on that label. I also mentioned there a little while ago that there are duties to notify to EU bodies, and in this particular slide I've laid out what needs to be done to notify information to the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki. So importers, and that is bringing chemicals in from non-EU countries, must notify specific details to what we call the classification and labelling inventory. And that's the rules for that are set out in CLP in Article 40. And you have to notify details if you're an importer of substances subject to registration, regardless or not of whether they're hazardous. This can be done through the registration dossier process. Substances classified as hazardous, regardless of the quantity. So whether you're bringing in 1 mil of a chemical or whether you're bringing in 10 tons of the chemical, the specific details have to be notified to ECHA. And also substances in mixture which would result in the overall classification of the mixture, they also need to be notified. To know the notification has to occur within 1 month of placing on the EU market. So if you bring something in at the beginning of January next year from Great Britain, you will be required to notify that to ECHA before the beginning of February. And you can notify through the REACH IT account, and there are just some specific details that must be notified. For example, the identity of the notifier, the identity of the substance, the classification and labelling details, etc. And I've put a link there on the slide that will be available afterwards on some support and guidance on how to actually complete a notification. And I also mentioned that there were notification obligations to national agencies. And in this particular case, I'm talking about notifying information to the National Poisons Information Centre, MPIC, at Beaumont Hospital. So all hazardous mixtures classified for physical or human health endpoints and placed on the Irish market must be notified to NPIC. Currently, what happens is importers and downstream users, formulators who make mixtures, have to submit information to NPIC before adding the NPIC number to Section 1.4 of a safety data sheet. And that section relates to emergency telephone information for specifically in the case of an accident. What's going to happen from the 1st of January, it's not just Brexit that's changing, there are also some changes taking place in CLP, and submission of information is moving to a harmonised system which will be managed by the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, and notifications for products that are mixtures that are classified for physical or human health endpoints, as I said, and placed on the Irish market, will be submitted via what we call a Poison Centre notification portal. And there's, again, certain information that is required, and there are also some timelines around this in that products for consumer or professional use must be notified by the 1st of January 2021, and those for industrial use must be notified to the PCN portal by the 1st of January 2024, with some derogations there for mixtures that will already have been notified to the Poison Centre. So I put two links there that explain a little bit more. One is for our own poison centre here in Ireland, and one is for the ANECA portal specifically dealing with information on this. So you may want to read that and just have a look at it. In addition to that, there will also be an obligation when you submit your notification for a UFI or a unique formula identifier number to go on a label. So you'll need to read up and see what actually is required with regard to that. And moving on a little bit then from CLP, we'll talk about safety data sheets. They're required and regulated under the REACH regulation. And Article 31 of the regulation sets out when a safety data sheet is required to be provided, and also details, for example, what language it needs to be provided in, etc. Annex 2 of the regulation then specifies the detail required in each of the obligatory 16 sections in the safety data sheet. And importers have responsibility for the content and accuracy of the information supplied in a safety data sheet, and also, of course, to provide it on through the supply chain. EU supplier details, just a few points I made here in the next few bullet points that would be very important to take account of if you are importing chemicals directly from Great Britain next year. So EU supplier details must be listed in section 1.3. So similar to what I said about putting the EU supplier details on the hazard label, the EU supplier details must be here in the SDS also. Important to remember that the information you put on a hazard label must be consistent with the details on classification and labelling in section 2 of the safety data sheet. And Irish occupational exposure limit values, where they apply, must be listed in section 8 of the safety data sheet. And that's something people often forget, and they leave the UKWELs, for example, in section 8, but you must have them listed in there. And of course, as I just mentioned, the National Poisons Information Centre, if relevant, must be put into section 1.4 of the safety data sheet. And a final note on that extended safety data sheets, or ESDSs as they're sometimes called, they are required for substances, hazardous substances that are registered at greater than 10 tonnes per year. And they have to be compiled, if relevant, by the importer and, of course, passed on through the chain to customers. And the other point I wanted to make about REACH were the provisions regarding restrictions. And restrictions are put in place under REACH for certain very hazardous substances. And they're to safeguard use, not just for professional and industrial users in the workplace, but more importantly, for consumer products. So again, importers have responsibilities to check for substances restricted under REACH. And just to explain a little bit more about that. So these substances are what we say are of unacceptable risk to human health and the environment. And they're listed in Annex 17 of REACH. And currently we have a list of 74 substances or group of substances restricted under REACH. What it means when they go on this list is that they cannot be manufactured, used or placed on the market unless they comply with the conditions of the specific registration and entry on Annex 17. And in some cases, this means that there is an outright ban on the use of the substance or on placing it on the market. And sometimes there are limitations on the use. And I'll show you just in a minute some examples of those substances and how the entries are worded. So again, importers are responsible for ensuring that substances imported into the EU comply with restrictions in that they are not banned. For example, that imported mixtures do not contain any banned substances, or indeed that the mixtures comply with the limitations set out in the restriction entry. And imported articles, for example, jewellery, do not contain restricted substances. So, for example, nickel and cadmium and lead would be some of the restricted substances in jewellery, or that indeed that articles would comply with the specific conditions set out in a restriction entry, as I said. And I said I'd show you some examples. So here's one that you might be familiar with. This is entry 6 on Annex 17 of REACH. And this relates to asbestos fibers. And you might see there that I have highlighted a little bit in red. And it says that the manufacturer, placing on the market and the use of these fibers that are listed in the entry is prohibited, and indeed their use in articles and mixtures is also prohibited. Now, there can be certain derogations set out in these entries, and they'll be specifically listed in how they could be used or what the exemptions are. And the next example I have here is for methanol, so entry 69, a more recent entry. And this is not an outright ban, as you'll see. It says that methanol cannot be placed on the market for general public use after a specific date in windscreen washing fluids or in defrosting fluids in a concentration greater than or equal to 0.6 as set out there. So again, it's a limitation, a specific limitation on the use. And I'm moving on now again to detergents. So this is the third piece of regulation that I'm going to talk about. And again, Irish companies who source detergent products directly from Great Britain from the 1st of January 2021 will become detergent manufacturers. There's a slightly different wording in the detergents regulation in that importers are included under the definition of manufacturers. So they have to take on full responsibility for compliance of detergent products being put on the Irish market. So what do importers bringing these chemicals directly in from Great Britain have to do? Well, firstly, they have to ensure that the detergent products are labelled and packaged correctly in accordance with all the rules set out in the regulation. They have to ensure that an ingredient data sheet is prepared, and they have to provide that on request from the National Poisons Information Centre. And they also have to make sure that a list of ingredients is made available on a website for consumers. So again, you'll notice there's two asterisks there, and just to note that for industrial detergents which are not made available at all to the general public, that those two provisions there regarding ingredient data sheet and the list of ingredients, they don't have to be carried out as per my slide, but the equivalent information can be provided by means of either a technical data sheet or a safety data sheet. And here I have taken a screenshot of, it's an information sheet we have on our website. We did in conjunction a number of years ago with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, who have responsibility for biocidal products and biocidal detergents. And you'll see there that I have two areas highlighted in the blue circles, and they relate to specific detergent regulation requirements. The first one there at the top is regarding EU supplier details, again, to make sure that the EU supplier is detailed on the label, and that the email address for the ingredient data sheet, where that can be obtained, is provided, and that the company website address is provided where the ingredient list can be obtained. And then the lower blue circle relates to specific labelling requirements under the detergents regulation, where you have to list, for example, enzymes, preservation agents, etc. And just to note on this slide that I have a CLP label here as well, because this particular example was for a hazardous detergent product. However, the detergent regulation labelling requirements also apply to products that would not necessarily be require a CLP hazard label. And if you are working with detergents and you are trading them, well then I recommend that you read the readiness notice that is on the Commission website at the link I have provided, and that will give you full details. It's specifically set out for stakeholders in relation to how the rules are going to work, and also with regard to how the rules work with the trade between Northern Ireland, and also Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And finally, the last piece of legislation I'm going to cover is the Export-Import Regulation, or sometimes this is called the Prior Informed Consent or PIC Regulation, so you might know it by either name. But basically what this regulation does, it deals with banned or severely restricted chemicals, and it controls the export of them essentially to non-EU countries. So exporters of these chemicals, when you're exporting out to a non-EU country, which Great Britain will be, as we know, from January next year, exporters have duties under the regulation concerning both the export and import. And the regulation allows countries to monitor and control export and import of the chemicals listed within the regulation, including the ability to refuse export or import, or indeed to place certain conditions on import of these very heavily restricted chemicals. So from the 1st of January 2021, Irish exporters of chemicals listed in the annexes to the regulation and sending them on to Great Britain will have obligations, and these include notification and reporting requirements. And just to mention there that chemicals under the regulation are industrial in nature, and we in the authority are the designated national authority with the remit for those industrial chemicals. And also it lists pesticides and biocidal products, and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine are the responsible authority with regard to those. So an export notification. All chemicals listed in Annex 1 of the regulation in Parts 1, 2 and 3 require an export notification before they are allowed to be exported. So exporters have to notify an intent to export to a non-EU country to their own designated national authority, that is where the exporter is based, via a system we call EPIC, which is an IT system managed again by ECHA. And that notification must take place 35 days before the first yearly export. So as I've mentioned, exports to Great Britain will require an export notification if the chemicals are listed on Annex 1 of the regulation. And ECHA is scheduled to make the UK available as an importing country on the EPIC system by early November 2020. And this will enable companies here in Ireland who wish to export early next year to Great Britain to actually make that notification available 35 days before they intend to export. There is also something called an explicit consent that may be required from the importing country. And that's for Part 2 and Part 3 chemicals within Annex 1. And this is required in addition to an export notification. So what are the exporter duties under the regulation then? Chemicals to be exported, must be labelled and packaged according to the CLP regulation. Export details of the chemicals on Annex 1 from Ireland to Great Britain must be reported annually to ourselves here in the authority as the designated national authority for industrial chemicals, or to the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine as the designated national authority for pesticides and biocides. And what you actually have to report are the quantities of the chemicals exported during the previous calendar year, and that must be done by the end of March of the following year. So there was a very good webinar a couple of weeks ago, ECHA hosted it, and it was Know Your Obligations under the PIC regulation. And I did a very detailed step-by-step approach as to what to do under the regulation, what your duties may be, and also how to actually go about submitting an export notification. I have the link there, and I would highly recommend anybody who would be dealing with the export-import regulation to have a look through that. Importers also have duties under PIC. So while import of chemicals is regulated by ourselves under the REACH regulation, import details of chemicals from Great Britain to Ireland must be reported again to ourselves for industrial chemicals or to the Department of Agriculture for pesticides and biocides. And the quantities of those chemicals listed on the regulation must be reported to us by the end of March for the previous calendar year's imports. And again, I just have a slide here showing the readiness notice that has been prepared by the Commission with regard to that regulation. And again, it outlines what the role are for stakeholders, what the implications are, for stakeholders, and also mentions how Northern Ireland is affected by the withdrawal of the United Kingdom. So finally, I want to go through some example scenarios here, and I've listed some scenarios that companies may find themselves in and how they would how they're going to be impacted under the REACH CLP and detergents regulations from the 1st of January next year if they're directly bringing companies in from Great Britain. So the first one here is we formulate formulate an adhesive. And the company use a substance sourced from a company in Wales, so that will be in Great Britain, outside the EU from the 1st of January, and one that's sourced from France, so within the EU. So very simple adhesive there. But just for the sake of trying to run you through what your roles or what you need to think about if this is something that you may be doing. So if we run across there from the blue box, so the formulator of mixtures in Ireland, in the brown box here they bring in a substance from Wales at greater than 1 tonne per year, cumulatively, as Magella has mentioned this morning. And from the 1st of January 2021, in the red box there you can see that this company is now going to be an importer, bringing a substance in from Great Britain, and they're going to have duties under the REACH and CLP regulation. The first thing that this company is going to have to check is the registration status of this substance. And you'll see there that in red writing on the very left-hand side, if no registration is in place, this means no market for this particular substance within the EU. So everything will have to stop until a registration is put in place. For the sake of going through this scenario, you'll see there in the green writing I have that the substance is actually registered by an EU-based OR. And in this case, your next step will be to check the restricted substances list and the authorization requirements for this particular substance. If there are restrictions in place which are not adhered to or complied with, or if an authorization, for example, is required and a decision isn't in place for this substance for the use, well, again, you're going to no market and you can't use the substance any further in the EU. However, as I said, for the sake of this particular scenario, we'll say that restrictions do not apply to this particular substance, or indeed that authorization does not apply to it also. So here in the 3 yellow boxes at the bottom, what you can see is that this particular company must determine the classification and labelling for the substance and ensure that it is in compliance with the CLP regulation. This particular substance is hazardous for health under CLP, therefore the company must notify the classification and labelling to ECHA, to the classification and labelling inventory. And once all that is in place and done, you'll see here at the bottom, the green box, they add in their compliant substance from the EU company in France, and they make the adhesive. And after making the adhesive, then of course the job doesn't end. You have to prepare a REACH compliant safety data sheet for that particular mixture. You need to classify, package and label the mixture as in accordance with CLP, and if relevant, notify the mixture to the National Poisons Information Centre if it's classified for health or physical endpoints. And the second scenario here that I have is a company that is sourcing a mixture from a company, from a distributor based in Scotland. So in this particular case, the Irish company is going to be an end user of the reagent. They bring it in from the 1st of January directly from the company in Scotland. This means again that they're going to be an importer under the REACH and CLP regulations. And if we move from the orange boxes from the left-hand side over to the right-hand side, I'll run through what needs to be done here. So firstly, again, check if the substances in the mixture, in the reagent, require registration. In this particular case, all the substances are brought in by the Irish company at less than 1 tonne per year, so registration does not apply. In the second orange box there, the company will have to check the restricted substances list, Annex 17 on REACH, and also check if there's any authorization requirements with regard to the specific use of this substance. Again, in this case, no restrictions apply and no authorizations are required. And if we move to the middle orange box there, the company will need to ensure that the classification, labelling and packaging details are correct for this particular reagent. And we see here that it's classified as flammable. So what the Irish company will have to do is notify the classification to the National Poisons Information Centre via the ECHA PCN portal that I spoke about a little while ago. On the fourth orange box there, you'll see that they have to determine and check the classification of the individual substances in the mixture, as well as looking at the classification of the overall mixture. And if it's a case that there are hazardous substances, as there probably will be in this particular mixture, then the Irish company needs to notify the classification and labelling of the substances causing the overall product's classification to the C&L inventory at ECHA via notification through Reach IT. And finally, on the right-hand side, the company in Ireland need to check the correctness of the information on the safety data sheet. And this is quite important to do because, of course, a risk assessment will need to be done for the use in the workplace. And then we finally get to the green box, at the very bottom, and the company in Ireland can use the reagent as a compliant product, compliant with the EU regulations. And the next scenario we have here is a company that distributes oven cleaners to Irish companies, and they buy the products directly in from a company based in London in England. Again, from the 1st of January 2021, this Irish company who wants to distribute the oven cleaner is going to become an importer, and this time, in addition to the requirements they have under the REACH and CLP regulations, they're also going to have requirements under the detergents regulations. So if I just start here again on the left-hand side, the company needs to check if the substances in the mixture require registration. In this particular case, no, they don't, because they're all brought in at less than a tonne per year cumulatively. They check again Annex 17 and the authorisation requirements, and in this particular case, there's nothing within the oven cleaner that requires restriction or indeed an authorisation for use. And then in the middle boxes there, you'll see firstly, that they again have to ensure the classification, labelling and packaging is correct. And I've added a little bit there, underlined, that the EU supplier details must be added to the label. So the Irish company who is going to distribute this oven cleaner on further must add their supplier details to the hazard label for this product. Also, as this product is an oven cleaner, it's a corrosive product. So therefore, notification of the classification of this mixture must be made to the National Poisons Information Centre, and as I said, that can be done via the ECHA portal. They also have to determine and check the classification of the individual substances in the mixture again, and because there will be substances in here that would classified for health and require the overall mixture to be classified as corrosive, notification must be completed by Reach IT to ECHA's classification and labelling inventory. And the fourth last box there is to check the correctness of the information on the safety data sheets. And as I said before, on the information or on the safety data sheets, ensure that the EU supplier details are in section 1.3, that the NPIC number, because it's applicable in this case, is in section 1.4, and that the OELs are correct in Section 8 of the safety data sheet, and of course consistency between the label and Section 2 of the SDF. And finally, because this is a detergent product, this Irish company has to ensure that the detergent labelling and the packaging is correctly assigned, that the website contains an ingredient list, particularly because this product will go to consumers, so that needs to be available, and that the IDS or the ingredient data sheet is available, made available and prepared. So once all of these elements are in place, then the Irish company is free to distribute to Irish companies or Irish consumers on the Irish market. And this is the last scenario I'm going to go through, and a simpler scenario, I suppose. This is a company who would buy varnishes from a company in Northern Ireland, and they use them as end users in their workshop. And the varnishes are supplied, as I said, by a Northern Irish company. The varnishes originate in Great Britain, in Manchester. So what happens here after the 1st of January 2021 for the Irish company? Well, on the green boxes, you can sit back a little bit, because the Northern Irish company who brings them in from Great Britain will have to ensure that the substances in the mixtures are registered if it's relevant. The Northern Ireland supplier must ensure that there is compliance with restriction and authorisation requirements. The Northern Irish supplier must also supply the Irish company with CLP compliant classification, labelling and packaging. And they're going to also be required to do up or make sure that there is an EU compliant or a REACH compliant safety data sheet. and the Northern Irish supplier must notify the CNL or the classification and labelling of substances within the mixture to ECHA and notify the mixture to the National Poisons Information Centre as relevant. And then in the orange box there, I've just put in what the Irish company must do, and that is check the correctness of the SDS on the label. And if something isn't right or isn't quite compliant to the EU rules, then you go back to your Northern Ireland supplier and ask them to correct that. And once everything is in place again on the green box on the bottom, you use the varnishes in the Irish workshop as an end user. So what do we want to take away from today? So if you're sourcing chemicals directly from Great Britain from the 1st of January in 2021, you're now the importer and the EU responsible person, ensuring that the classification, labelling and packaging is correct for the substances or the mixtures that you're dealing with, that you've notified hazardous substances to the classification and labelling inventory in ECHA as relevant, that the details are supplied to the National Poisons Information Centre via the ECHA portal, again as relevant, and that the safety data sheet is correct and compliant with the REACH regulation. Your supplier details have to be on both the label and the safety data sheet in section 1.3 as the EU supplier of this substance or mixture, and that substances are registered, and Magella went through that in great detail this morning. Also, with regard to restrictions, if they are applicable, that they are complied with, whether that be a ban or specific limitations on the use of a substance. Substances subject to authorisation then are covered by a decision granted by the Commission, and that there is an authorisation in place for that specific use. If you import chemicals that are listed under the PIC regulation, then that you report those either to ourselves or the Department of Agriculture annually. And if you export chemicals listed on the PIC regulation from the 1st of January 2021, you have to complete, as I said, an export notification for the chemicals listed in Annex 1 at least 35 days prior to export, and you have to check if explicit consent is required for Part 2 and Part 3 chemicals. And again, reporting on annual exports by the end of March. And with that, I am going to leave you with a slide on some support, and as Magella said, we're here at the Chemicals Help Desk to answer your queries. So thank you.